Hello, everyone. Welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. I'm Alison Gampel, Associate Director of Alumni Programs at York University. Thank you so much for joining us today for June 20th, 1981, the Battle of Church Street and the founding of Pride Toronto. We're happy to offer this special Pride-themed lecture to you today. This webinar is part of our Scholars Hub speaker series and features timely educational lectures by academics and researchers from York. It's important that we remember the history of how today's Pride celebrations stemmed from riots and fighting for justice of marginalized people. Knowing where we come from is key, and I know that today's webinar will be educational for all of us. I'd like to personally thank those who have fought to create a safe space for my 11 and 13-year-old children, and I'm emotional talking about it. My 13-year-old daughter just received her school's inaugural Pride Award. And that's thanks to the work of so many people who have fought before us. So from my family to yours, happy Pride. I want to acknowledge the land that York's campuses are built on. As this event is virtual and we're not all gathered in the same space, I recognize that the following land acknowledgement might not be for the territory that you are currently on. If this is the case, please take the responsibility to acknowledge the traditional territory that you're on and the current treaty holders. As a member of the York University community, I recognize that many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York University campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York University acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tkaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabeg Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I personally am grateful for the opportunity to live and work on Treaty 13 land. In light of today's discussion, I'd also like to acknowledge Two-Spirit people, the disruption of Two-Spirit teachings that was made, and the ongoing impact of colonization. In creating the term Two-Spirit, the founding group wanted to reflect the historical acceptance of gender variant peoples and diverse sexual identities within Indigenous communities. Before I introduce our speakers today, some news from the university. I am very pleased to announce that York is moving forward with plans to establish a new School of Medicine that will focus on training family and community doctors in an integrated setting. Establishing a School of Medicine has been a long-term strategic priority for York, and we are so pleased to be moving ahead with plans to submit a formal proposal to the provincial government later this year. Please visit yorku.ca/medicine for more information. Now, we do like to get to know our audience better with a quick poll before each lecture. So if you could answer today's question, the question is, and it should appear on your screen, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? So you see the poll popped up on your screen, and let us know how much you know about the history of Church Street and the founding of Pride Toronto. Okay, thank you all for participating. It's really helpful for us and for our speakers to have an idea about who's here in the audience and the knowledge that you each have about the topic of discussion for today's event. In terms of some housekeeping, if you need any help with the Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. Our team is ready to help you. The same button can be used to submit questions for our guest speakers during the Q&A period following the presentation. And for those friends watching live on Facebook, please feel free to submit any questions or comments in the comment section for the video, and the team will send them my way to ask on your behalf. Please do note that all of your questions and comments are visible to our panelists and to our staff behind the scenes. We ask that you keep your comments relevant and respectful. So on to our talk today. We are featuring Dr. Tom Hooper, PhD from 2016, Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies. He is a historian of the Toronto bathhouse raids and the criminalization of the 2S LGBTQ communities in Canada. His work is also dedicated to dismantling the myths that have erased these histories. Welcome, Dr. Hooper.
Thank you for having me, Allison.
Thank you so much for being here. So I'll let you take it away, and I'll be back after your presentation.
Sounds great. I'll just need a second because I have to get my PowerPoint put on behind me here. There we go. I think that should work. Okay. So thank you for organizing this to the YorkU Alumni Association. I'm Tom Hooper, as I was introduced, and I'm a member of contract faculty in both the history department and the law and society program, and have been since I completed my PhD in 2016. So I'm really happy to be here and to contribute to this Scholars Hub series at York. So today I'm talking about the Battle of Church Street. And so one thing that I find when I approached my PhD research is that a lot of people were familiar with the 1981 Toronto bathhouse raids. But when I talk more about the history of what occurred throughout 1981, I found that fewer people knew about what occurred after February. And so what I'd like to do today is talk about the longer history of 1981 and some of the other events that took place that were beyond just simply the major bathhouse raids that many of us already know. So the bathhouse raids that I'm referring to are the February 5th raids, in which more than 300 men were arrested in one night. This was a major police operation. And the following night, it led to a whole bunch of people pouring out into the streets and demonstrating against police violence and demanding justice. This theme has been taken up by Pride Toronto this year in celebration of its 40th anniversary. And I've posted on my beside me here, actually on this side, there we go, the text from the Pride Guide. And so this is sort of the narrative that I see frequently when talking about the origin of Pride Toronto and the history of the bathhouse raids. So as it says, 4 bathhouses were raided under what police called Operation Soap. So their intention here was to clean up the city. There were more than 200 officers who did this raid. So this is a mass police operation. When we think about mass police operations and cleaning up the city, I can't help but just make a comment in solidarity with the people who were displaced at Trinity Bellwoods by a major police operation yesterday. And it's just a very strong sign that this battle that I'm talking about today isn't over. So in 1981, as the Pride Guide says, there were over 286 men who were charged with being found in a common body house. 20 more were charged with operating a body house. And after that, later in the year, just glossed over the rest of those months, the Lesbian and Gay Pride Day Toronto was formed. And that was sort of the first Pride celebration that was organized in June. There were Pride celebrations previous to this, but this was considered the first official Pride. And for some reason, Pride Toronto thinks it's important that the day they were incorporated is something that they should mark. I'm not sure why. So Pride Day, the first Pride Day on this narrative occurred on June 28th. So there's a leap here. There's a leap from the bathhouse raids in February to then Pride Toronto being formed on June 28th. And this is the leap that I have a problem with. And this is sort of the narrative. We go bathhouse raids on February 5th. We have February 6th protests. The police learn their lesson, and we can all celebrate in June. And this is sort of the trajectory of the historical conversation. And this is a problem because it assumes that in February 5th, with the raids and with the resistance, the battle was over, and that was it. The police never did it again. Well, that's not actually true, and I'm going to explain today why. So I think it's a problem when we forget June 20th, 1981, because this was another police operation that was used against our community. It was during a protest demonstration, and it was what I would classify a police riot. While the protesters were largely being peaceful, and there were some anti-protesters, some queer bashers who were trying to cause trouble. It was really the police that escalated the violence on June 20th. And I think it's important that we talk about that today. So there's 3 points that I want to make in today's conversation. The first is that remembering June 20th reclaims a history of pride that is grounded in resistance to police violence. The second is that this history is inseparable from the struggles of Black, Indigenous, racialized people, trans people, and sex workers. So what was occurring on June 20th in the streets, what was occurring throughout 1981 in the streets, was a struggle that was not separated by, that was only for white gay men. This was a mutual struggle, and I'm going to explain why. And then finally, I'm going to argue that this struggle continues today and that this is not yet over. I want to talk about sex workers first, because there's an important link that we have to make between the criminalization of homosexuality and the criminalization of sex workers. And this is why our communities came out into the streets together to fight against police violence. You'll note I've listed all of the criminal offenses that were used to criminalize homosexuality through Canadian history. Buggery was an offense that wasn't often used by the time we get to the 1970s, but it was also applied to bestiality. And the point here is that every offense that was used was also used to criminalize other people. So there was never a criminal offense that only applied to homosexual acts or to homosexuality. It was a network of all of these vague 19th century morality offenses. That is how queers were criminalized. Every other offense aside from buggery was also applied to sex workers. So all of the offenses that I have listed here, gross indecency, indecent act, vagrancy, immoral theatrical performance, obscenity, and then of course body houses, which was used in the bathhouse raids, these were applied both to homosexuality as well as to sex workers. So there's a mutual struggle here in what was going on in resisting these bathhouse raids. 2 of these, by the way, were reformed in 1969. And for some reason that's been labeled decriminalization. But as I just noted, in 1981, there's over 300 men being arrested under the body house law. That doesn't, to me, sound like decriminalization. So that's what enabled the bathhouse raids to occur, because it was technically against the law to own or operate a bathhouse, or even be found in a bathhouse for that matter. So on February 20th, 1981, there were a series of protests. The February 20th protest was one of the largest, and it was one of the most organized. And joining that protest were a series of speakers. One of them was Lamona Johnson. Lamona Johnson was the widow of a man named Albert Johnson, who was killed by police in 1979. Lamona Johnson took the stage and defended to us LGBTQ people in this moment, in this critical moment in this fight against police violence. There are deep connections that were made between a largely white, queer activist community that existed along Yonge Street and Church Street, downtown Toronto at this time, as well as the Black activists who were fighting against police injustice and police violence. This mutual struggle continued through the 1970s, and because of that mutual struggle, Black activists came out to defend against the bathhouse raids. And so what we see in the streets and in the organizing and in the activism in 1981 is the coming together of this mutual struggle between Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, to us LGBTQ people, and sex workers. And so these 3 forces came together in a mutual struggle against police violence. And this is the context in which Pride was formed. And I think this is too often being forgotten. Also forgotten is that the police didn't learn their lesson. You would think after these massive protests in the streets and such a public backlash against the police operation in February, the police didn't learn their lesson, and they didn't change. They didn't reform. They raided the bathhouses again. So on June 16th, police raided 2 more bathhouses in Toronto. They arrested more men, 21 men in this raid. And it was just a signal to the community that no matter what, no matter all of the work that went into all of those protests and trying to rally against them, the police were going to continue. And so because of that, the community decided they were going to go back out into the streets, as they had done so many times in 1981. So they organized a rally on June 20th, and I've sort of mapped this rally because for the next few minutes, I'm going to talk about what actually happened on this night, on June 20th, because I think it's an interesting story, and I think it tells us a lot about the founding of Pride Toronto. So it began at 10 o'clock p.m. and it concluded around 12:30 a.m. in a massive brawl. There were speeches, there was an unauthorized sit-in, there were effigies burned, there were queer bashers who showed up, there was a police riot where the police attacked the community and the protesters. There were merely 6 arrests, despite all of the queer bashers showing up, causing so much violence. And there was also a full emergency room at Wesley Hospital. So that is the totality of this protest, or a big overview of this protest, and I'm going to go through each of these points now. So at 10 o'clock p.m., the protest began, and it began at Yonge and Wellesley. This image is actually from a February protest, but it was at the same location, and they took up the same position at the intersection, the northeast corner, where there was an elevated concrete step, and that was where community members could give speeches. So they repeated that for the June 20th protest. They went back to that same corner. This image is actually a perspective from the concrete stage. So this is looking down at the crowd. This would be the perspective of the speaker. So at 10 o'clock p.m. at Yonge and Wellesley, the crowd gathered. There were speeches by notable lesbian activist Chris Birchall, Reverend Brent Hawkes, among others. The slogan was "Blow the whistle on the cops." Everyone showed up with whistles and caused a bunch of noise. And unexpectedly, from the cop perspective, the crowd was so huge that they just took over the entire street. They weren't just confined to the sidewalk, they occupied the entire street. From that point, they decided to march north on Yonge Street from Wellesley toward Bloor. When they got to Yonge and Bloor, there were a few rogue marshals. So protest marshals, the people who were part of the organizing of the protest, they conducted an unauthorized sit-in. They wanted to make a statement at this intersection. So this was in the middle of the intersection at Yonge and Bloor. You can see the image here of the Bay sign actually looks fairly similar to today. So this was the unauthorized sit-in. It only lasted a few minutes because other marshals, not understanding why a sit-in was taking place, caught up to the crowd and encouraged everyone to stand up and keep moving. But the statement was made. They were going to occupy the street if they needed to. And I think that was a strong, powerful statement. So while it was unauthorized, I think we can all be glad it happened. The marshals resumed the march, and they marched east on Bloor Street toward Jarvis Street. At 11:45, they reached Jarvis Street and Charles Street, and this was the location of police headquarters in 1981. There were more speeches, and in the middle of those speeches, effigies of Attorney General Roy McMurtry and Police Chief Jack Ackroyd were burned. They were set on fire. And this caused a huge celebration as the crowd danced around those and cheered. And after that display, the crowd dispersed. Many went west along Charles Street. Some others went south on Jarvis to head back toward the Church Wellesley area. For those who walked along Church Street, along Charles Street. They, as they headed toward church, a group of queer bashers, so these heterosexuals these men who showed up and they were taunting the crowd, they were yelling epithets at the crowd, and they were also threatening violence. And at this moment, once the crowd dispersed from police headquarters, the queer bashers suddenly found themselves outnumbered. And the crowd was not disciplined and organized the way the marshals were handling it, because the protest was supposed to be over. And so a group of protesters just had enough. They realized that they had the numbers behind them, and they started chasing these queer bashers. The queer bashers were very scared from my interviews, the people who were involved in this, and they ran fleeing. They fled to Church Street, and they ran north on Church Street toward Bloor Street. As the queer bashers ran north, the police created a line. They created a police line. The queer bashers ran past the police line, so they were safe. The police saved them. And protest marshals formed their own line facing the police. So this is at Church and Charles Street. So the police raced to rescue these queer bashers, and they formed their line, and the marshals formed their own line. Meanwhile, a police car that was parked south on Church Street was abandoned. And several of the protesters who had dispersed noticed this abandoned police car, and they began rocking the police car. When the police officers who formed the line on Church Street saw that the police car was being rocked by the protesters, that's when the police decided to charge in. They charged through the marshalling line, they charged at the protesters, and they embarked on what I would call a police riot. Protest Marshal Tim McCaskill was knocked on the head by police with a billy club. A police car, number 5210, that I've made a little icon of. The police cars, by the way, were yellow, 1981, in case you didn't know. This police car 5210 sped toward queer activist Ken Poport, striking him, coming to a stop, and then speeding away. So this is just a picture of one of the gay men who were arrested by police during this scuffle. And this is another image of the police advancing on the protesters once they noticed that the abandoned police car was being rocked. And another sort of example here of the melee. So it was really, once the lines had disintegrated, it was just a free-for-all, all along Church Street, along Charles Street. It even extended over to Yonge Street. So the crowd eventually dispersed. The police dispatched additional riot cops with more billy clubs. They dispatched horseback police officers. And so there were more battles with cops around this neighborhood. Meanwhile, Ken Poport and Tim McCaskill compared their notes while they were on a hospital bed at the Wellesley Street Hospital. And they reported that the ER at the Wellesley Hospital was full of bruised and bloody protesters. So that's just a short, in about 15 or 20 minutes here, of the Battle of Church Street and what had actually occurred there. I just want to conclude by making the comment that this, to mark the 40th anniversary of Pride, and to gloss over or to completely ignore this particular battle, this particular protest, this was huge. You saw all the pictures by Gerald Hannon, by the way. I just want to note the amazing work of photojournalist Gerald Hannon of capturing these amazing images. This was a significant battle. This was organized in part by a group called Gays and Lesbians Against the Right Everywhere, GLARE. And that was the exact same group that was responsible for organizing the Pride Day. On the Pride Day, on June 28th, so 8 days after the Battle of Church Street, our community, again, we had a celebration picnic for sure, but we also had a march. And we marched down to the police station that was responsible for the bathhouse raids. And there were members of our community, the Sisters of Perpetual Indulgence, one of whom was actually arrested in the bathhouse raids. They performed an exorcism on the police station during the Pride Day protest. So I think these are really important elements of the history of Pride. And I think it's important that they be remembered, but we also have to ask why it is these moments are being forgotten. Thank you very much for tuning in and paying attention to this talk today. Thanks.
Tom, thank you so much for sharing your work and the history. It certainly is sobering and difficult to see those pictures and hear the history. So thank you for gathering this work and for sharing it with our community. It's really important. Okay. So now we have time for questions. And so please feel free to our audience members, use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and I will ask any questions that you have of Dr. Hooper on your behalf. So you can go ahead and type in your questions. I'll start with one question that I have, and the question is, why is this history being forgotten? Right? Why are so many people hearing about the Battle of Church Street for the first time now?
I think it's being forgotten because we're deciding that the queer history, the history of the bathhouse raids, is about white gay men and about their experiences, their protests, their developing a relationship with police that many people see as the sign of progress. So when you see history that way, if you see 1981 as going from repression to celebration, then you can justify the debate over, okay, yeah, we have to include police in the parade, or we can't stand for, we can't have our pride organization standing against police killings of Black and racialized people. We can't have our pride organization criticizing the police for doing nothing while many men of South Asian background went missing and murdered from the village. So I think there's a problem when we create history that way, when we ignore these important connections. That's why I wanted to devote today to really understanding, when you talk about the body house law, you can't talk about that without talking about sex workers. When you talk about police violence, you can't talk about that without talking about how police interact with Black, racialized, and Indigenous people. So I think it's important that we remember those aspects and we resist the processes that encourage us to forget those connections.
Thank you for that. We have a question coming in from Neil, who says, Neil is curious about the Emmanuel Jacques murder in 1977, the resulting cleanup of body houses along Yonge Street, and the demonization, perception, targeting of gay men as a result of the connection of the bathhouse raids in 1981. So can you comment at all on that?
Yeah, so Emmanuel Jacques was a 12-year-old shoeshine boy of Portuguese descent. And he was kidnapped and murdered and sexually assaulted as a result of several body rub parlors that were operating on Yonge Street. These were I don't know how we can classify them this way, but heterosexual body rub parlors. Like these were spaces of sex work where women sex workers were catering to men clients, but some of the workers at one of these body rub parlors were involved in that kidnapping, sexual assault, and murder. And they were eventually found, actually with the help of the gay community, and brought to trial. The result of this, so the Emmanuel Jacques murder really focused attention of the police on the Yonge Street strip. There was the strip of body rub parlors on Yonge Street called Sin Strip. And so the police really started cracking down on sex workers after that. I get this question a lot about Emmanuel Jacques and its relation to a clampdown against queers, but it actually affected sex workers much earlier than it affected queers. There is an argument that suggests because of the homophobic atmosphere after the Emmanuel Jacques murder, the members of the Portuguese community protested, demanding to bring back the death penalty for homosexuality. Other leaders in the community, in that community, came out against that, just to make clear. So there was this heightened atmosphere of homophobia, and some think that this is what prompted the police to target the bathhouse raids. I'm a bit resistant to that conclusion because police were raiding bathhouses in Toronto even before the Emmanuel Jacques murder. So while I think that that murder was, an important part of this story, I'm not sure that it quite was a direct link to the raids on the bathhouses. But thank you for that question.
Thank you for answering. And I just want to pause and just there are actually a lot of questions and comments that are coming in through our Q&A. So thank you to our audience for being so engaged. And I just want to share with you, Tom, messages like, thank you for this powerful presentation are coming through. From Marcel, Dennis says, it always distresses me when I see history being rewritten. And I applaud Tom and others who've done the research on history and bringing it to our attention. So I just want to share those comments.
Is it Dennis Findlay?
Yes, it is. It is.
Oh, okay. So Dennis, because he intervened. So Dennis was a member of the Right to Privacy Committee. And this was the group that was responsible for resisting the bathhouse raids. They were one of the groups, along with Glare, who organized the January 20th protest. Dennis was a member of a group called Gay Court Watch, and they actually went and camped out at the courthouse to try to intervene on queer people who were arrested. And what they did is, here's a flyer, here's a lawyer, here's a defense fund, fight this and we will help you. So for Dennis Findlay to thank me, I think, I thank him every day of my life. So thank you. I dedicated my PhD dissertation to Dennis Findlay. So thank you for coming, Dennis.
Lovely. Okay, so I'm going to ask a question that's coming in from Trevor. Trevor says, hi, Dr. Hooper. Thanks for your presentation. I'm wondering how we can talk about the forgotten queer histories within the broad society and teach them in the classrooms.
Yeah, it's difficult because there's like a huge, when you talk about the forgotten queer histories, I think they were forgotten for a reason, and it's actually swimming against the stream to try to get them back. I mean, I'm trying to do it. I think it's going to take, historians and activists, and especially historians who aren't embedded in universities. So I'll give you an example. One forgotten element of our history was the first bathhouse raid in Canada, or what we think is now is, we could always find another first, so who knows? But I always thought the first bathhouse raid was in 1968, but a high school teacher, Walter Cassidy in Windsor, Ontario, did digging and discovered that Windsor was actually the site of the first gay bathhouse raid in 1964. So I really think it's going to be about making our past more accessible to more researchers, for anyone in our community to go out and start piecing these things together. I think that will result in rescuing a lot of these forgotten histories. So the person who asked the question, I would just encourage you, become a historian. You don't need a PhD. Just start doing some searching and start looking through the evidence and contact the archives. We have they used to be called the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. Now it's called the Archives, ARQUIVES.
Thank you for that. And I'm going to turn to a question coming in from Gary about the relationship between some of the groups. So Gary says, thanks, Tom, for speaking against the social organization of forgetting and the resistance of remembering. Could you tell us a little bit more about the relationship between GLARE, LAR, the RTPC, and the Lesbian and Pride Committee in 1981? And I apologize if I mispronounced any of these. Also, the rise of racist, anti-feminist, anti-gay right wing at the time.
So just some of those acronyms. GLARE, that I mentioned, that one, that's Gay and Lesbians Against the Right Everywhere. LAR was Lesbians Against the Right. They were a group that had been affiliated with GLARE. And then there was the RTPC, that's the Right to Privacy Committee. That was the group that organized several of the protests and also raised a lot of the defense funds for those who were charged. And then there was the Lesbian Gay Pride Day Committee in 1981. So there was a lot of mixing and in and out of these groups. I think Gary is actually a perfect example of this. Gary is in the minutes for GLARE. Gary is in the minutes for the RTPC. He's in the minutes for the Lesbian Gay Pride Day Committee. So these are not, we can't understand these as completely separated groups. And I think what the question he's asking about the anti-racist and anti-sexist and these other movements, these groups, they worked alongside the International Women's Day Committee in that year. They also worked with a group that was fighting back against the rise of the KKK in Riverdale. So Riverdale, there was going to be a KKK office that was going to open up there. And because of this community resistance of queers coming together and other community groups coming together, they protested this. They held a picnic in Riverdale Park, and they successfully prevented the KKK from opening that office. So that was also happening. That KKK intervention in Riverdale was in May of 1981. So all of this, so thank you, Gary, for bringing that in, because I think it gets to that link between what was happening with the bathhouse raids and with Black, Indigenous, and racialized people, and the links, the mutual struggle between those.
Thank you for that. I just want to share with you, Tom, and with the audience, our Dennis Findlay, and thank you as well for being here, made a note about some progress being made, which I think is great. Dennis says that teaching queer history in classrooms is actually a work in progress. And at this time, the archives that you talked about is working on curriculum programming that will be available for teachers to use in their classrooms in the future. So that is some very optimistic news to share. I'm gonna turn to a question coming in from Wesley, and I'm gonna read it to you. Wesley says, "Thank you for historizing the covertness of criminalization, violence, and LGBTQ institutionalized racism in present day narratives. I like how you framed the common sense understanding today of pre-gay rights making the links with other forms of activism, invoking a queer racial consciousness that opens the door for anti-Black racism, anti-Indigenous racism, and the common sense thinking that whiteness overdetermines queers." And then Wesley asks about one of my favorite places. What role did Hanlins Point and UFT play in contribution to this historical activism?
Well, thank you for the comments and on the connections that I think we're trying to bring back here. In terms of Hanlins Point has a long history in our community. Going back to August 1971, that was the first sort of marking of a Pride Day. And so that was held at Hanlins. There were other events that were held at Hanlins through the 1970s. But I also need to point out that Hanlins was a site of surveillance. So another group, in addition to our communities that would hang out there, were cops. Undercover cops love to hang out there. They loved to hang out in the bushes to see what was going on back there. And they would hand out, anywhere from tickets for, nudity to making charges of gross indecency or indecent acts. So Hanlins Point is a really important space for us. Sacred ground is what I would call it. And it was in the news over the last few weeks of a homophobic attack that occurred there. And I was really amazed at how the community was able to come together and piece this together and to provide help for the person, for the victim, and to provide assistance for them and to help find out who the suspects were. It was remarkable to see the community respond, and in such a supportive way, but also so quickly and so efficiently.
Thank you. So we have time for 2 more questions. So we're not going to be able to get to all of the questions, but I'm going to ask 2 more. Claude asks, what further action can we do to decenter white gaze from the larger pride conversation and bring attention to those who need our recognition and support?
Well, I'll start with the archives, and they are doing a lot of work to try to go out and get different perspectives in their collections. So one of the biggest problems is the collection of materials, of historical materials that would be made available to researchers has largely been from these predominantly white centered queer orgs. So the Right to Privacy Committee, for example, or the Body Politic, these are some of the most consulted, largest collections that they have. And unfortunately, it's that is a limit on the types of histories we can tell. Our histories are dependent on the sources that are available. And it's not that those sources don't exist. So, Black queers, racialized queers, Two-Spirit peoples, those histories are there. It's just they haven't been collected by mainstream queer organizations. So I think one of the biggest things we have to do is focus on reclaiming those sources. The other thing is the imagination. So it's all about how we imagine queer history. We're often writing history to try to create this narrative of belonging, of human rights, of becoming accepted by the liberal state. Or we're writing about all of the times we're resisting to that. I mean, I'll be self-critical here. This is a very limited imagination of what 2S LGBTQ experiences and histories were. There's so much more to be discovered. I think it's just tip of the iceberg of what we have. So it's 2 things. We need to do much better at going out and getting those sources, that evidence. We also need to really refocus a different imagination of how we're approaching queer history.
Thank you for that. I think that ties in nicely to what sadly will be our last question on this talk, and it comes from Todd. Todd says there have been strides in Canada, for example, same-sex marriage. What do you feel are the top changes in society needed to make it such that the LGBTQ plus community feels completely seen, equal, and safe in Canada?
I think the number one thing that has to happen is this focus on the police. We have to reimagine how we deliver safety, how we think of safety. And I really don't think the institution of policing is the future. It's the history of this institution is one of enforcing colonization. In the United States and even in Canada, it was used to enforce slavery. And that is the historical legacy of this institution. There have been a lot of attempts, I think, to try to dress this up and make this look nice, to try to make it change. And what we've seen is this institution is so resistant to change. When we have, in 1981, police parading into the bathhouses and causing a whole bunch of violence. And then this week, we have police parading into Trinity Bellwoods Park. I don't see that as progress. So there have been legal changes that are measurable. Same-sex marriage, definitely. The addition of human rights, definitely. Like, I'm not saying there's been no progress on those fronts. But if we are to actually start talking about true equality, then I think we have to start looking at what it is we're doing with the police. It's also, we can't, who are we measuring this idea of safety and equality? Who is it that feels safe in our communities? Is it me, the white man professor, or is it somebody else that we're asking? And I think that's the problem. Is I've been asked a lot how safe I feel, and I don't think that's capturing the experiences of the community.
Thank you for that. You know, you make an interesting point that makes me reflect upon my own family, that, you know, my children say they feel safe with their LGBT identities, but they get texts from their friends asking, how do I talk to my parents? You know, can you give me advice? And, you know, so I'm with you in feeling that there still is so much work to be done. So with that, we thank you so much for sharing your work with us here today, for sharing this important history and helping the message get out. So thank you, and happy Pride.
Thank you for hosting this, and thank you for everyone for these wonderful questions. I don't often say wonderful questions. These were truly wonderful questions, so thank you for that.
Wonderful. Yes, a huge thanks to our audience for engaging and making it so hard for me to choose which questions to ask. I apologize that we couldn't get to every question and comment. Tom, we will try to send you some of the comments, because there was so much appreciation expressed to you for being here and sharing your work with us.
Thank you.
You can turn off your video now, and I'll just conclude the event with our audience. If you can just answer one final poll question that's about to pop up on your screen. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following the discussion that we've just had? So I'll give you a moment to respond. Thank you. Thank you for that. Be with us next on Wednesday, July 7th at noon. Scholars Hub at Home returns with a talk that's titled Resistance, Restlessness, and Residential Schools. For more information about the Scholars Hub at Home series, as well as all of our other virtual events, please visit our website at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. We thank you all for being here today. Wish you health and safety. Be well.